welcome to Booktalk with the Daughters of St. Paul. I'm Jeannette de Beauvoir.
And my name is Allison, Gliot, and I am a postulant with the Daughters of St. Paul, which means basically that I'm in the first stage of formation with the Daughters.
And we were talking last week some about G.K. Chesterton's book Way of Wonder, which is part of the Classic Wisdom collection that's published by Pauline Books and Media. And we're going to continue today for our second session. We hope that you've had a chance to look at the book. If you haven't, that you're really interested and want to look at the book. And as I think I said last week, there are plenty of opportunities online. If you don't have access to Way of Wonder for some reason, there's a lot of his work that is in the public domain. All you have to do is Google it. Read the Wikipedia about him, too. I mean, what a fascinating man this was. I know that you mentioned last week that he had a sword in his cane, which doesn't sound exactly like...
Well, his wife made him carry it around because people were just making fun of him for being overweight, and she wanted him to have an image. And so she was like, if you wear a cape and a funny hat and a cane sword, everyone will take you very seriously.
There you go. And he was enormous. He must have had some problems going upstairs, I would think.
Well, he did say that like his favorite natural loves in life were food, drink, and time with good friends. So
sounds pretty good to me, actually, but okay. Anyway, we talked last week a whole lot about the concept of wonder and about how Chesterton talks again and again about rejoicing in the things that are ordinary in life. And in fact, that there are not, in essence, and actually this is one of his, I wouldn't say really disciples, but someone who was very influenced by him was C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis said, there are no ordinary people. You've been talking to an immortal soul when you've been talking to someone else. And how extraordinary is that? Which is really echoing a lot of what G.K. Chesterton says. So today we thought we would just jump into the book. As we said before, we don't have the kind of time it would take to go through every single chapter, and so we really want you to read it. But we're going to skip one and go directly to goodness. And there's a reason we chose that. Do you want to talk a little bit about why we chose to talk about goodness today?
Sure. First of all, it's really important. And Chesterton says this like it's one of the most important things. It's how God describes himself as good. It's how we're all called to be good. And it's something that's a little bit unpopular, I guess, in today to talk about being good.
I think good sounds boring to a lot of people, which again is this refrain that Chesterton says that there is nothing that's really boring, that everything is amazing, but goodness in particular is.
Yeah, one of the ways that he describes it, and it's in this book, is he describes it to the color white. And so people will say that, oh, white is a boring color. It's not even really a color at all. It's just kind of bland and neutral. But Chesterton's like, no, white is like the brightest, most brilliant color out there. Like it makes such a statement. And like when you have red, you draw roses. When you have white, you draw hot stars. Like this is like
searing
kind of
through the sky.
And so similar to that, like goodness is not just something that's bland and neutral or like a non-thing like the color white. It's like really like amazing, and the sort of depth that you find in goodness draws white hot stars, sort of like, the color white. So I love his way of describing that.
That is extraordinary. One of the things that I think is difficult for us is that a lot of these words like good and like virtue and in fact like nice are words that we don't associate with strength and with interesting things and people. It's sort of bland, and that's our culture that's done that. The words themselves really aren't, and the concepts aren't. I would just share a story that you don't want to confuse goodness and niceness. And I'm of a generation that my parents taught us to be nice. We could be whoever we wanted to be professionally, but we were girls, so we had to be nice. And I carried that with me. And when I was doing my master's degree at Yale Divinity School, I was absolutely honored. My mentor was Father Aidan Kavanaugh, who is just one of the premier liturgical scholars, was one of the premier liturgical scholars in the world. But he also was fairly famous for not getting along as well with women as he did with his male students. And I ended up in one particular class being the only woman there. And some other students were having a bit of an argument about something. And he must have been watching my face, because he said, "So what is it? What are you thinking? Why aren't you engaging here?" And I just said automatically, "I'm just trying to be nice." And he just drew himself up and he said, "Young lady, the world was not saved by someone being nice. The world was saved by someone dying on a cross." And that just exactly, it leaves you breathless. But it's true, Jesus was good. Jesus was the epitome of goodness, and yet he saved the world by dying on a cross. I mean, we follow someone who died for us. There's nothing insipid or nice or halfway there about that. That's the pinnacle.
Yeah, and let's not forget that people put him on that cross, and that was because he wasn't nice. He didn't play by their rules. He drove people crazy, and they wanted to kill him.
But also because of his goodness and because of his virtues, the very things that we're saying
different than everything.
Right.
Everything else.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And Chesterton really is looking at that core principle of the faith that, we talked last week about incarnation, and the other side to incarnation is the death on a cross, and that this is the edge. This is where people live and die and survive or don't, and we're talking about it like it's just, as I said in my class, I'm just trying to be nice.
Yeah, that's something that I love C.S. Lewis as well as Chesterton. And C.S. Lewis is really big on that distinction between niceness and goodness, too. Like, he talks about, we're not called to be nice, we're called to be good, we're called to be Christians. And there's actually a whole chapter in his book, Mere Christianity, about that. And I'll just read, one little quote. I know this is about Chesterton.
No, it's good. C.S. Lewis loved Chesterton, so we're good
so
company.
It's allowed.
Yeah, it's allowed.
C.S. Lewis said, "A world of nice people, content in their own niceness and looking no further, turned away from God, would be just as desperately in need of salvation as a miserable world, and might even be more difficult to save."
Yeah, well said.
Yeah.
Well said. Well, I think that one of the things that he's getting at here with this chapter on goodness, and that Aidan Kavanaugh was getting at, and that C.S. Lewis is getting at, is that one of the things that makes us feel really uncomfortable is this sense of binary. That in our culture in particular, we've been taught not to judge to the point where pretty much anything goes. Oh, it's okay if you do X, Y, Z because, it's a permissive culture. And to come back to this binary of if there's goodness, then there's also evil. And no one wants to talk about evil. I mean, if it's bad enough to talk about goodness, we don't talk about evil.
It's true. It's an idea that people are really uncomfortable with, to the point of almost denying its existence. Like, no one wants to call anything evil. And of course, we shouldn't be calling any person evil, but
there's evil in the world.
Yeah. We're not living in a relativist world. God made things good, and things are evil. Yeah. And so one of the ways that Chesterton describes that really puts it into perspective is that he says that the world can be made beautiful again by beholding it as a battlefield. When we have defined and isolated the evil thing, the colors come back into everything else. When evil things have become evil, good things, in a blazing apocalypse, become good. And so that idea there, if you get rid of evil, then you can't really have goodness either.
Right.
You can't understand goodness. But
balance.
if you have both and you recognize evil and you recognize goodness, then you really understand the real position that we are in a battle between good and evil, and you can't remain neutral. You have to pick a side.
Right. Yeah. And again, Chesterton's brilliant paradox, the beauty of a battlefield. That's really taking our perceptions and standing them on their ear.
Yeah, and it's the sort of thing that people who ignore what's going on around them drive Chesterton crazy, and he's very vocal about that. But it's the sort of thing that this is a battlefield as he sees it, and by not doing anything, you are picking a side. Like, just because you're closing your eyes to evil or goodness doesn't mean it's not happening around you and that you're not participating that in some way. And so he really, like, to be aware and conscious of the reality of things, that there is good and it's very good, and there's evil and it's very evil, is something that is so key for him, and he brings it up again and again.
And in many ways, he's echoing the Gospels, where Jesus is constantly, in many different ways, saying, choose. You've got to choose. You can't love money and love God. You can't do these things that you think are going to blend together because they make you comfortable. He was probably the most uncomfortable person to be around, and yet we love him. And he loves us. But that this echo of, you've got to make a choice. You can choose good and you can choose evil, but you've got to choose one of them.
And Chesterton makes it pretty clear what side God is on and all that. He says that God himself will not help us to ignore evil, but only to defy it and to defeat it. So one way or another, you're either fighting with God on his side or you're fighting against God.
And there's a certain, I think, glamour that people have attached to evil, if they those who are willing to engage with it at all. There's that whole popularity of the vampire culture, or all this sort of otherworldly things that people, I think, substitute for religion because they have a need for something that's quote unquote spiritual, but haven't made that choice yet.
And you can even see it in, like, advertising, the words people choose to describe products. They'll be like, oh, it's sinfully delicious.
Right.
Or, like, wicked good, or something like that.
Painfully cold,
and if you're looking at what these words actually mean, like, they're not good things. Like, we have a confusion of what they really are.
Right.
And we're attaching meanings.
Do you really want something that's sinfully delicious?
Yeah. I want something that's divinely delicious. Right. That's different.
And then you can appreciate, like, the lamppost. You had to be here last week to understand the lamppost, but hopefully you did.
Yeah. And so another way that Chesterton kind of approaches the problem of evil is explaining that it's not powerful in itself, like it's not its own thing, that really the nature of evil is only a mimicry of something that's good. And this is something that I loved to study about in theology when I was in college, that Satan can't create anything new. He can only distort and pervert what God has created good. Satan is not a creator. God is a creator. And so we call Satan the father of lies because he can't say anything new. He can only distort truths that God has already given. And I think that's something that Chesterton really hits on, and something that is good for us to be aware of, because evil things do, in a sense, resemble good. Like, we see something called sinfully delicious and we're like, oh, I want to eat that. Yeah, exactly. But the danger of mistaking the evil for the good is something that Chesterton is constantly, like, pointing out, like, no, do not make this mistake.
Right. And the touchstone, as you said, is where it comes from. If it comes from God, then there's goodness in it. We tend to also think that, you know, we can do what we need to do in and of ourselves. So I can become good. I can be good because I chose to be good, instead of saying that, goodness is a grace. And yes, you can aspire to it, and yes, you can open your heart to it and pray for it. But it's not like, oh my goodness, he's good, therefore, you know, good for him, bravo. No, it's not something you exert yourself and then get. And I think that Chesterton is pretty clear about the relationship between goodness and grace.
I had a professor once describe it to me that holiness and goodness is not something that you, like, grit your teeth, like, oh, I'm going to be holy today. It's going to be It's something that you have to relax and really let God take control and turn yourself over to him. And when you do that, you don't have to grit your teeth to become good or become holy. Like, God will help it happen.
And then you start to see goodness in that different light, where it's not like white, the absence of color, but if you see it as coming from God, then it's bathed in this amazing light of God's love, and goodness becomes this thing that you want more of.
It's actually attractive.
Yeah, exactly.
People actually knew what they were talking about when they said that a good thing is a good thing.
What a surprise. All right, we're talking about Way of Wonder here on Book Talk with the Daughters of St. Paul, and we'll be right back. Hi, and welcome back. We are talking about G.K. Chesterton's Way of Wonder, and before the break, we were talking about something that's pretty unpopular called goodness. And our next chapter that we're going to look at is equally unpopular. It's faith, hope, and charity. Why is that so unpopular?
I think that people have old-fashioned connotations with faith, hope, and charity. And
right. It sounds like something someone sewed into a sampler and put on the wall, right?
It's
colonial
like
America.
But I think that people hear these words thrown around a lot, faith, hope, and charity, and then they don't really, they don't think about what it actually is. And so this chapter is really nice because Chesterton treats each of these individually the way Dale Alquist compiled it, and then also a couple of them to show their
puts them together so that they're this sort of something to hang your faith on.
Yeah, they can kind of provide a framework for all of the other virtues, I think. Yeah, so one of the ones that I really like is faith. And the way that Chesterton describes
Since she's
faith.
a postulant and all, it's a good thing that she likes faith.
Well, hope and charity are also very nice, but I'm starting with faith. So one of the quotes that he says about that is that on page 50, "A man must take what is called a leap in the dark, as he does when he is married, or when he dies, or when he is born, or when he does almost anything else that is important." And I think that idea of taking leaps in the dark on a regular basis and not just like one dramatic moment of your life is really important. And for me in my discernment with the Daughters of St. Paul, it was actually very hard for me to take that leap of faith into the dark. I remember I was discerning with the daughters for about a year before I decided to apply, and my spiritual director was a Franciscan priest who went to my college, and he told me that, he used this image with me, that I'm standing on the end of a bridge, and I can't see all the way across to the other side, like it's too far. But if I never start walking on the bridge and I never take that step, then I'll never know what's on the other side.
Right.
And that was kind of like the advice that I needed to be like, okay, I don't know 100% sure that God is calling me to be here, but I think this is the direction he wants me to go, and he wants me to trust him.
And it's worth finding out what's at the other side of the bridge.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I took that faith of leap in the dark. I applied, and I'm here a year later, still happy, still feeling like I want to find out what's on the other side of this bridge. But it's a really beautiful time in postulancy to continue discerning that. And so I'm not stuck here. I could turn around and go back on the bridge if I get to the other side and figure out that's not for me.
Right.
But I would never have discovered this space of freedom to discern more what God wants for me and God's love for me if I hadn't started walking and took that leap of faith in the dark. And so I love that Chesterton understands that dynamic and how it's scary.
Well, that's it. I think that one of the things about, we say have faith, or have faith in her, or have faith in God. And the reality is that faith is really hard and scary because by definition, it's not something you can see, perceive, understand, know. And we live in an instant gratification culture where we want to see, understand, perceive, know everything right away.
And you're considered very foolish or imprudent if you go forward without knowing exactly everything.
And to essentially put your hand in God's hand and say, I believe you're going to bring me where I need to be, is hugely difficult.
Yeah.
I want to say it's especially difficult for our culture, but I think Chesterton made it clear that it was difficult for his culture. And it probably has been difficult for so many, otherwise Jesus would not have said, "Oh, ye of little faith," when Thomas needed to put his hand in his side.
Yeah, and hope is really tied into that too, because faith is like taking a leap in the dark, and hope is hoping that everything is going to turn out okay, even when it's completely crazy. And so Chesterton talks about the distinction between regular everyday hope, that like, oh, you can reasonably hope that the sun is going to rise tomorrow.
Right.
But if he says the virtue of hope exists only in earthquake and eclipse, so it's harder to have hope that the sun is going to rise tomorrow if there's an eclipse and you don't know what's going on and you don't know where the sun is. But like that's when we're called to have the supernatural virtue of hope.
Right.
And that's
of faith that God's going to be in charge. I mean,
they're very closely tied together.
That's the bottom line, is that no matter what happens, I may not know what's going to happen, but I do know who's in charge of it.
Yeah. Trust God.
But I do think that for so many reasons, we live in a world that's losing hope or has lost hope. Because we see history repeating itself, because we have problems with our kids, because we have every day there are a million reasons to lose hope. And to read Chesterton is to say, that's, again, turn that around somehow.
And I think that part of the reason why we live in a culture that's losing hope is because our reason for hope, we know as Christians, is God and God's love for us and salvation for that. But if you lose sight of that, then you really don't have a reason for hope. And Chesterton always ties it back into no, we hope in God, and that's the source of all of this. Faith, hope, and charity is God, not us.
Yeah, I was very close with one of my teachers in school, who was an elderly sister, and she said, it shocked me at the time when she said this, but she said, if I didn't have God, why wouldn't I commit suicide? And in a sense, that's awesome. Why wouldn't you? It's amazing to me that people who don't know God still carry on.
Yeah, can live as happily as they do.
Because
so hard.
It's so important to keep grounded in that, to keep some sort of hope and say, okay, the kingdom of God really is at hand. It may not be literally at hand on earth tomorrow, but to live in the sort of, not shadow because that sounds negative, but in the expectation of the kingdom of God is what keeps you going.
Yeah, and to remember that Jesus said he would be with us unto the end of the age. That doesn't mean that he's only going to show up at the end of the age. That means he's with us now. The kingdom of God.
I'll see you in 3 centuries.
Exactly. We have reason to be joyful. We have reason to hope.
Right. And also, it also means, I think, and I think that Chesterton bears this out, that not only are we hoping for the future in terms of the kingdom of God, but we also have an obligation to hope for the world and to try and make it a better place before the kingdom of God is accomplished. And that is borne out by Pope Francis, and that's borne out by Jesus in the Gospels. That he's not saying sit around and wait for it to happen. He's saying, give to the poor and feed the hungry and clothe the naked and
bring out the gospel to all nations.
Right. So obviously there's care for what's going on here. And you can only do that if you've got some faith and some hope.
Yeah. It's true.
And then there's charity.
Charity's also pretty fantastic.
Also a tough one, though.
It's true. I think a lot of times people don't quite know what it means, because charity, another word for it is love, and our English language is very poor when it comes to describing love. We only have one word for it. If you look in Greek, there's lots of words for love, and they all describe different senses
kinds
of
it.
Love,
right.
But when Chesterton's talking about charity, he's not talking about lovey-dovey romantic love or anything like that. He's talking about real love in concrete situations. And so I think we mentioned last week that quote where he's talking about you make your enemies and your friends, but God makes your next door neighbor.
Yeah.
And that one of the hardest things to do is love the person that God set in front of you. And that's something he talks about. St. Francis of Assisi was a good Christian because he didn't love mankind in general. He loved man, each individual man.
And he was the one who said, you may be the only gospel your neighbor ever reads. So to live that out with the people around you.
Yeah. And Chesterton loved St. Francis of Assisi, wrote a great biography of him. But that's the example that we're supposed to be following. That's what Jesus wanted us to do, is to love the individuals. He didn't come to this earth and say, oh, humanity, I love you so much. He said, oh, Peter, do you love me? I love you.
Right.
That.
Right.
It's the individual. He gets to know the people.
And it's worth noting that in the early church, there was something called the 3 pillars, which was prayer and penance and charity, which was almsgiving. So it was, and just as important a part of the penance and fasting and the prayer and worship was taking care of others, which is charity, and
That's true.
And we use the word now to make it sound almost negative, oh, I don't take charity from people. Whereas this is as much an obligation as being and part of being a Christian as any of the other things.
It's true. Well, and Chesterton actually in here talks about how
Exactly.
beggars are one of the best examples of good Christians because they know how to accept charity, like with open hands, and not be able to give anything in return. I think a lot of times when we come to God, we're like, I'm asking all of these things for you, God, but like, I'm going to give you so much back.
Right.
And like, so I basically
if
deserve
you give me
this.
this, then I'm going to give you that.
It's like,
right?
it becomes transactional, but like, that's not what God wants for us. He has a free relationship of love where he's giving us, you can't even count the love that he has for you, and you can never give enough back. And
Exactly.
so charity is really like letting that freedom of love, letting love run wild. And Chesterton gets a good sense
another
of that.
Chesterton phrase,
I know.
running wild. Yeah.
Yeah, quoting lots of Chesterton. He's all in my head now.
All right, Allison and I will be right back. We're talking about G.K. Chesterton's Way of Wonder. All right, well, welcome back. We are here, the Book Talk with the Daughters of St. Paul. We're talking about G.K. Chesterton's Way of Wonder, one of our favorite books, and certainly one of the spiritual classics, I think, of our age. I think it's not false to call it that. And we've talked about some things like goodness and wisdom and wonder, and now we're going to talk about a chapter that is Dale Alquist, who did the compiling, calls Everyday Holiness. And I love this chapter title because it is so Chesterton, because it's such a paradox. We think of holiness as something that's apart from life. You feel holy when you go to church. You feel holy when you're praying. And it's interesting that I say feel, because we're talking about something that's not necessarily a feeling, but we like to feel it. And then you've got the everyday, which is, you drop the cereal on the floor and you have to mop it up, and, your boss yelled at you and then you were late for something. And everyday life just seems to intrude on our sense of holiness. And what Chesterton is saying is that, no, it's not. It's not that it intrudes on it. It's that it's intrinsically connected to it, and that you can't separate them out the way we want to, because we want to make life neat and tidy and have lists. And Chesterton's not saying that holiness is not just in churches and monasteries and convents. Holiness is out there. It's on the street. It's in real life.
And Chesterton knows what he's talking about because he was a layperson too. He had the ordinary life thing down. He wasn't a priest or someone. He definitely wasn't living in a monastery.
Definitely wasn't living in a monastery. What was that about food and drink?
Yeah, he likes the good things of life too much.
The good things in life.
But so he really understood that, and he talks a lot about how to not get stuck in routines, because I think that's something he really emphasizes wonder and the importance of that. But I think even for him, he had to remind himself that don't just go on autopilot and it's hard to be intentional all the time, and he gets that. And so he talks about how it's really hard to encounter God in your everyday life if you're not paying attention to what's going on in your everyday life. And so wonder is so closely tied into there. But one of the distinctions he makes that I really like is the difference between real joy and mere amusement. And so when we're going through routines and we're just doing the things we always do without thinking about them, we're oftentimes amused. We wouldn't say that we're unhappy or anything, but it's not the deeper joy, the true joy that we experience if we're really in God and really, looking at that true holiness. And so I'll just read a little passage about that on page 81. So he says, "Unless we can make ordinary men interested in ordinary life, we are under the vulgar despotism of those who cannot interest them, but can at least amuse them."
Right.
It's kind of scary to think about. But that's our mission as Christians is to witness to that true joy and show people there's more to life than just amusement.
And that joy really ties into this concept of holiness. That have you heard so many times the expression holy joy? And if you look at the saints, many of them had extraordinarily difficult challenges, and yet what you get from reading their writings or from hearing other people talk about them is this sense of deep and abiding joy. And they were probably people also who noticed, oh, the sun came up. How extraordinary is that? Oh, the lamppost. How extraordinary is that?
And I can testify, living in the convent now for a little bit over a year, that I see this in my sisters every day, that they have that ordinary holiness of the ordinary life, and there's that joy. Even if I'm visiting a sister in the hospital, she's laughing and she's happy, and it's not because her health is good, because it's not, but it's because she has that deeper confidence in God, and she has that to cling on to.
And has it in an everyday kind of way.
Yeah.
So it's not just on Sundays. It's not just when something wonderful happens to you. It's every part of every day.
Yeah, I think I've laughed harder with the nuns than I have at any other time period in my life.
No one parties quite like nuns, it's true.
Yeah.
Well, one of the other people that, and we try not to bring too many other people into this besides Chesterton, but St. Francis and, in fact, Pope Francis are also people who really reflect this kind of sense of everyday holiness. St. Francis said, you may be the only gospel your neighbor ever reads. And there's a sense of every day you need to be grounded in what it is that you believe, and what all the other things, the wonder and the faith and the hope and the charity and all the things that he talks about in way of wonder. You need to just, as you said, keep reminding yourself of that.
Yeah, and I think, as I mentioned, Chesterton has the biography of St. Francis of Assisi, and so some of his most beautiful passages talking about religion and how we should live our religions in everyday holiness is when he's talking about St. Francis and what St. Francis did. And so one of the things that he said is that people found St. Francis really confusing and didn't understand how he could be so joyful but then also living so poor and all of these other paradoxes in his life. And Chesterton says that it all makes sense if you understand that for him, his religion was not a thing like a theory, but a thing like a love affair. And that idea that really it's not something abstract, it's something that it's a relationship with God. And that's something that's very important for Chesterton, is not forgetting God when you're going to pray or do all of your pious practices or enjoying the liturgies and stuff, that it's about God and it's to help you become closer to him.
And to balance that biography, we have to say that he wrote the definitive biography of St. Thomas Aquinas, who could not be more different from St. Francis. And in that paradox too, I see Chesterton, not just because his mind was able to grasp the theology of Thomas Aquinas, which is not for the faint of heart, one has to say, but also because that is the way he lived this concept of religion. I mean, we talked about him being a convert, and it seems to me that converts think a lot more about what they're doing than we who maybe grew up with the religion and maybe have gotten a little bit rote about it, not seeing the holiness in the everyday. He's able to do that to the point where he could embrace people as disparate as St. Francis and St. Thomas Aquinas.
It's true. And one of the things that Chesterton talks about that was important for both Thomas Aquinas and St. Francis of Assisi is mysticism, and how that's not something that's just for top-notch saints like Francis and Thomas Aquinas, but that really it's for the everyday person. And the way he describes it is that mysticism is a sense of the mystery of things. It's the most gigantic form of common sense.
Right.
And so he describes it as something like people think of mysticism as it's this dark, secret thing that only a few can attain to. But Chesterton says that it's something that's exceptionally luminous and opened, and it's too obvious for most of us to see. And so it's getting back to that wonder. Again, it always comes back to wonder.
Right, exactly.
Really, yeah.
There's a Protestant theologian called Frederick Buechner who talks a lot about mysticism, interestingly enough, because that's not usually associated with the Protestant tradition. And he says, we're all more mystics than we think. And mysticism is where religion starts. It starts with a voice in a burning bush. It starts from all these things that, at our best and at our most aware, we know are there, but we let life get in the way. And that's exactly what this is, talking about, is that keeping that at the center, keeping that, whatever it is, that lump in the throat or that voice from the burning bush or whatever it is, keeping that at the center of, dropping the cereal and missing the bus.
And expecting to find God in unexpected places.
Exactly.
Like when Moses discovered the burning bush, he was just tending his sheep, like doing what he did every day. Like it's something that Chesterton wants us to be aware of in everyday holiness, is that if you're going to be trying to live a holy life every day, you have to be expecting to run into God every day. And he'll find you wherever you are.
But wherever you are, he will find you.
It's true. But that's a good thing. We want that to happen. And it's something, it's so beautiful to be caught off guard by God. And we leave ourselves open to that when we're living consciously of everyday holiness.
And you also have to note the accessibility of it. I think you were right earlier when you were talking about Chesterton being a layperson, that holiness and mysticism are not just for, a Carmelite nun in a convent far away or a priest or a bishop, that we are all called to it, in a sense. Every Christian is called to be holy, and that sounds difficult and unattainable, but actually what he's talking about is how incredibly accessible it is for everyone.
And I love that he was talking about this at the beginning of the 1900s, before the church was really saying that as something that we needed to do, but it's been there in our Christian tradition all along, and it's something that Vatican II really emphasizes. The Second Vatican Council talks about a lot. Recent popes have talked about. Pope Francis just released a new encyclical where everyday holiness is pretty much the entire emphasis of the encyclical.
Yes, exactly.
And so this is something that Chesterton was foreseeing, almost as a prophetic voice of no, this is something we need to get on board with. It's lay people are going to be saints too, and he saw that, and he really tried to live that in his own life.
And it's one of those paradoxes that people found very unsettling at the time, and probably many of us still find unsettling now.
Yeah, it's true.
All right, well, we're talking about Way of Wonder, G.K. Chesterton, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Book Talk with the Daughters of St. Paul, and we are concluding our whirlwind tour, and it really was a whirlwind tour of G.K. Chesterton as seen through Way of Wonder, which is a compilation of a lot of his work. Its subtitle is Wisdom from G.K. Chesterton, and certainly I think that's a good summary. Wonder and wisdom.
It's true. We talked about a lot of different things really quickly, and so if you want to get an overall kind of contextualized version of what he thought, really just read the book and read him. It's better in his words than in our words talking about him.
Exactly.
As fun as it was to do.
Yeah,
this.
we can't recommend it strongly enough. And as we've mentioned, you don't have to sit down and read the whole thing through. You can just
open up to any
page and you will find something interesting. You'll say, oh. And then one of the other things we really wanted to do is, if you have been reading this with us and if you are interested, we thought we'd make a couple of recommendations for other Chesterton books that we've liked. And I have to recommend, and I got this one in first, so she couldn't. But the classic, it's truly the classic G.K. Chesterton. It's called Orthodoxy. And don't be scared by the title. It sounds like it's going to be stuffy, and it's anything but. It's actually an intellectual delight. The language is gorgeous, and at the same time, like the things that you'll have read in here, it really was written for the ordinary person. I don't think there's any concept in there that you can't wrap your brain around, and he really explains things beautifully. But it's also witty and it's funny, and it really is a great example of his ability to frame big ideas in sort of bite-sized pieces that you can. I'm not sure you can do Orthodoxy the way you do Way of Wonder and just open it to a page and find something.
Probably not.
But you can do it chapter by chapter, certainly,
definitely.
and come away with something that is truly extraordinary. And I do want to read a short passage to you because it's talking about a way of dealing with the world around us. And it really reminds me of what we were just talking about before the break, which is the everyday holiness. So this is from Orthodoxy. For our titanic purposes of faith and revolution, what we need is not the cold acceptance of the world as a compromise, but some way in which we can hardly hate and hardly love it. We do not want joy and anger to neutralize each other and produce a surly contentment. We want a fiercer delight and a fiercer discontent. We have to feel the universe at once as an ogre's castle to be stormed, and yet as our own cottage to which we can return at evening. And I love that, because that is the world. And what he's saying is, you don't pretend that it's one thing or the other. You take everything in it and you make sense of that, and you allow God to help you make sense of it.
Yeah. It also, the book Orthodoxy tells the story of Chesterton's conversion.
Right.
And so it's kind of the thought processes that he had to go through to get to Catholicism. And so it's very interesting in that respect. And you really get a strong feel of like who the person of Chesterton is.
Exactly. Exactly.
Is,
you read it and you feel like you know him.
Yeah. One of my recommendations for a really good book by him is The Everlasting Man. And I mentioned that C.S. Lewis, this was his favorite book of apologetics for the normal person, not the theologian. And so that one, basically it starts out with the history of humanity and like all of creation. And it's like a really big project for him to take on. But
Let's start at the very beginning.
Exactly. But like the book actually isn't that long, and it's a pretty fast read. But then when he gets to Christ, you see how the person of Christ changes everything. And it's really that incarnation that we were talking about earlier on in the book talks is really the center of the everlasting man. And just spoiler alert, the everlasting man is Jesus. So
don't tell.
But
read it.
So there's one quote that I'd like to read to you from that one, is that there are two ways of getting home, and one of them is to stay there. The other is to walk around the whole world until you come back to the same place. And so that kind of shows Chesterton's approach to religion and God. Yeah. And so another recommendation that I have, if you're interested more in his fiction, The Man Who Was Thursday is very good, but the Father Brown...
It's disquieting a little bit, The Man Who Was Thursday.
It's true. I could not predict anything that happened in that book. I tried really hard.
You won't.
But if you're looking for something maybe a little bit lighter, the Father Brown mysteries are really nice.
They're wonderful. They're not really nice. They're wonderful.
They're really nicely wonderful. And they're short stories, and so you can read them in any order. Each one is only like 10 or 12 pages long, but they have the reoccurring character of Father Brown, who is the mystery-solving priest. And I have this little game that I play. I'm actually reading them right now, where I try really hard to predict what the ending is going to be ahead of time and see if I can outsmart Chesterton. And it hasn't happened yet, but I'm still trying. So.
And one of the things I like about the Father Brown series is that you think on one hand, wait, murder mysteries. This is not very Christian in orientation.
But it is.
And that's exactly what we're saying about he really embraces all of life and then turns it around and makes sense of it. And I think the Father Brown mysteries are every bit as deep as many theological tomes I've read.
Yeah, and you'll get a sense for Chesterton's views on pretty much everything. By reading them, because he brings it into each of the stories, because they're not just told for entertainment's sake, they're also told to like get a point across.
But it's unobtrusive. You never have the sense that he's lecturing you. You never have the sense that, oh, here's the idea that he's trying to hammer home.
It's true.
It just is intrinsic to the story.
Yeah, Father Brown is one of the most inoffensive characters that I've ever read, so you can't possibly get mad at him.
It's very smart.
It's true. Yeah, so that would be my recommendation.
And that's also been made into a movie series or a television series?
TV show, yeah. BBC originally did it. I think it's on Netflix now, so feel free to check that out. Yeah. They did take some liberties with the storyline and stuff, but the
they transposed the time, I think. I think it's in the 50s.
It's set in the 1950s instead of Chesterton was dead by then. But sorry.
Not to put too fine a point on it. Okay, so those are our recommendations. Read Orthodoxy, read The Man Who Was Thursday, read, what else?
Father Brown.
Father Brown.
Basically read anything by him.
Basically read anything by him.
It's all good.
And as we said earlier, if you didn't get that, Google him. A lot of this is in the public domain, so it's available for free online. So, sort of dip your toes into the waters of G.K. Chesterton. And the best way to start is, of course, with Way of Wonder, part of the classic wisdom collection from Pauline Books and Media. And this has been a fantastic couple of sessions with Book Talk of the Daughters of St. Paul. It's been wonderful getting to know you, Allison.
I'm so happy to have been able to join you.
And to have another Chesterton fangirl around is pretty cool. So we're glad you joined us, and please join us again. And again, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to put them. I think it's right underneath the screen where we are now, and someone will get back to you. Thanks again. This is Jeannette de Beauvoir.
And Allison Gliot.
And this has been Book Talk with the Daughters of St. Paul.